what does the research say? Obviously, you'll have your own training professionals and professionals around you, golf club managers, who I'm sure will be able to give you some good ideas on how you can maximize the participant experience at your facility. But sometimes it does pay to look a little bit more widely. And we know that from some of the research that when we look at development through sport, it develops, as John Cote says, it involves a complex pathway that's shaped over and by numerous factors over time. There's not one silver bullet in this space where we can say, right, if you do this, you're going to generate significant growth in the number of people coming into the game, or you're going to create greater sustainability of those who are already in the game. If it were that simple, then I think we'd see less of a fluctuation in participation rates within the game and within sport as a whole and physical activity. So we know that it's a pretty complex set of factors that are at play here. We also know that sports participation and performance neither results from involvement in just one single activity, nor is it attributable to a specific personal characteristic. We know that there are people who come into golf very much later in life. Even at the very highest level, you've got people playing on the world stage who don't pick up a golf club until they're 14, 15 years of age. And equally, you've got those that are playing on that same stage who started at the age of 3, people like Tiger Woods, who might be sort of silly, very, very young. Equally, we know if we're looking at perhaps more realistically greater participation in the game to support the running of golf facilities and the game as a whole, then whether or not people start and pick up a club at 4, 5, 6 years of age or come to this game at 55 years of age, it really shouldn't matter, and there won't be one type of individual, but it will be important that you are able to adapt your coaching to help them have the best experience they can possibly have. So one of the papers that I'm going to put up that we don't currently have online, but I thought was, as I was preparing this session, was really useful, is a participant development paper that was written by Richard Bailey, who's a sort of a friend of the PGA and done a lot of research in and around golf, and Graham Ross from Sport England at the time. The paper talks in depth about things like the complexity of the biopsychosocial, as the BPS model that everyone brings to the game. So people develop physically in very different ways. They certainly develop significantly different ways, psychologically, emotionally, and socially as well. And if you just look across some of the groups that you already work with at junior level or at adult level, you'll see that at play. And therefore, it again becomes a nonsense to try to put a one-size-fits-all approach when you have this complexity right in front of you at the start of every session. Equally, there's some discussion within this paper around early specialization, and I think it would be fair to say that whilst there are potential benefits, there are also potential pitfalls, some of it that you'll have covered in your sports science module, but the paper just highlights one or two more of those areas, and again, a recommended read. Fundamental movement skills is an interesting area, one in which, from a practical standpoint, it certainly does appear that people who haven't developed good throwing, kicking, coordination type skills seem to struggle with hitting a ball from off the ground with a golf club where they're stood to the side, more so than we might expect from other sports. But at the same time, this space at the moment is also suggesting that how much do we need to ingrain these fundamental movement skills in order for it to transfer into somebody being able to swing a club around their body in an arc to hit a point on the ground. So it's an interesting area to start to develop, and certainly one that in previous times I've spent a lot of time trying to look at patterns of movement for typical throwing and hitting motions and how they've correlated with the player's golfing ability, and I seem to see some good connections there, although, as I say, the research is probably a little more skeptical of that link. Practice, practice, practice. So again, as you go through year 1 into year 2, we'll touch on more and more how people practice, as well as the amount that they practice. And there's certainly some really good evidence now of quality of practice being at least as important as quantity of practice, if not. And then the back end of this paper talks a bit about things like relative age effect. So the linking into sort of early maturers, if you like. So people who are born in the sort of the back end of their sort of birthday window, the sort of the school year, the academic year, the sports year. That those who have the opportunity to be more physically developed than their counterparts, typically having some greater advantages over time if they mature a little bit more early, both especially physically in some sports. In golf, perhaps are able to hit the ball. You know that there is a nice counterbalance to that with the sort of more fine motor skills of short game putting, which can offer a really good equalizer. But how children especially develop early can influence significantly the types of opportunities that they get to access better training, better competition, and that can accelerate a minor difference early on. And so really worth looking at, and worth considering. Are you judging somebody on their current performance because they're slightly more mature in perhaps in that physiological as well as psychological aspect, or are you looking perhaps a little bit more into trying to look into the future a little more and anticipate what they might be able to do? Keeping people in the game, I think, is a really good. Keeping the more people within the game before you start to make selections is often seen as a really important trait of coaching programs. And through coaching programs mindset at the moment, my son is going to rugby coaching, and there's an element of selection in there. But one of the key attributes Coaching Academy is looking for, it's a rugby coaching academy, is the mindset and the attitude towards being coached, towards the game, towards the way in which they are individually developing, as much as the technical skills that they currently have. And a phrase is sort of how coachable is the child is one that sort of springs to mind in this space, that if you have children or participants who are coachable, then that really is a massive advantage for you as a coach, as opposed to somebody who finds the struggle difficult. And so growth mindset versus fixed mindset is a space to consider looking at, to appreciate a little bit more about that. We also have the ages and stages, which fits in to some of the models that we'll talk about later. And perhaps in between those ages and stages are things like transitions. And again, whilst you have access to the libraries, Stambulova is a prolific author in this space around what they call career transitions, but which are basically lifetime and lifestyle transitions into schools, out of schools, into work, and how they affect people's motivations and aspirations to continue to play certain sports, or the priorities that they have, which you might not knowingly think about if it's not brought to your attention, but which will certainly play a role in whether or not they choose to start another game, a game like or a sport like golf, or stay in a game. And then ultimately luck, one of the bits of areas of research that is really quite developed, is this idea that there's a certain amount of luck in whether or not people are able to participate or stay involved in the game. And so some of the areas that you'll see here on the in a little graphic around, is funding becoming available, what's the individual's access to facilities like, what does the peer group that they are involved in sort of that individual's experience, and the geographical location of you in comparison to the individual's house might play a massive role in whether or not somebody's able to continue to carry on and play sport. So we're going to look at just a couple of models. I'm going to ask you to go away and research these if these are of interest to you. We wanted to make sure that you're aware of these models because whilst they're not necessarily golf specific, they are sports specific, and they do give you some good insights into how across sport, juniors especially, or young people or younger people, will typically experience sport. And so this is probably one of the most popular, one of the most well-researched models. It's the developmental model of sports participation that Jean Cote and Hay wrote about back in 2002, had quite a number of iterations since then. And they have documented through observing participants and interviewing participants how they've transitioned into sampling, where they've looked at the amount of deliberate play, so playing with a specific goal in mind versus deliberate practice, which would be more orientated around what the coach is specifically asking them to do and ways in which they are practicing, and involvement in numerous sports, as opposed to this early specialization that we touched on previously in the slides, and it's been touched on in the sports science module, and you'll find good reference to it in the golf coaching material as well. That people come in and early specialize and then have significant amounts of deliberate practice and perhaps less deliberate play, and focus on one sport individually. So this model is trying to articulate ways in which people engage in sports, how they work through sports, whether they start to specialize a little bit later or a little bit earlier, whether they drop out and become more involved in sort of recreational golf rather than that's a sort of recreational activity, rather than investing time to try to pursue a more elite level or to be the best that they can be. But a model that's very much worth looking at. Similarly, there's a model from Richard Bailey and colleagues, which is called the Three Worlds Continuum, which again is part of your reading material, which looks at participating for personal wellness, participation with participant referenced excellence and elite referenced excellence, and looks predominantly at the motivations that people have as they move up in years with regards to why they take part. And so you'll see on the right hand side of the chart here the age, and as what Bailey and colleagues suggest is that individuals can have multiple motivations. So we could be doing it partially for just personal wellness and social reasons, but equally they could be as a participant challenging themselves to reach a certain standard, or they might even be looking more externally at the way in which the elite performers of today are playing to reference their progression. And so you might see little bits of all of them, or you might see a very dominant motivational force at play, and you might see that also change as they go through life. So I take myself, I would have certainly been initially in this 12 to 14 group looking more in this space, that I just enjoyed the social interactions with the other kids at the golf club. Well, it's always been very competitive, so I had an element of personally referenced excellence, but I wanted to get good at this. As I probably progressed a little further, I became more aware of my competitive desires to be as good as I could be, and had a little bit more of an angle towards looking not necessarily at elite reference excellence, but the excellence at the level above me, which would have been the county level, the regional level. And then ultimately, even though I became more professional, I became a professional. Really now, in my role and where I'm going with my golf, I'm back to this participation for personal well-being, whether that's social and physical well-being, and really have no ability or no inspiration or aspiration to work as hard as I can, which will be a pure personally referenced excellence, and certainly not to get back out and play professionally. Things people do move across those, and again, it's important for you to be aware of why people play or why they're playing, and how that might change as they go through the ages. This is a pretty complex model, which is the long-term athlete development, or LTAD model, which has within it really largely the physical elements, physical development, looking at things here like speed and endurance and strength and windows of opportunity, which I know with Jack you'll have gone through that in sports science, so I'll leave you to review some of the material that you've got there on long-term athlete development, but it's certainly a model that has been adapted. If you go online and put into Google the Canadian long-term athlete development program for golf, you'll find this program developed into some actual golf specific programming within Canada, and they've used that really quite successfully over the years. Finally, we've also, in terms of models, there's a model that is an evolvement out of Jean Cote's work and the developmental model of sports participation, which started to analyze in terms of the youth development, how the people that you interact with, the areas and the settings in which you interact, and what it is you're doing will ultimately influence your competence, connection, and character. So those 4 C's. And their inference from that is that through these who, where, and what, as you develop your 4 C's, that will have a significant influence on the amount of participation that is seen in the game, the performance, and that personal development, which is obviously a really big one for us, even more so at the sort of the younger ages and the junior and youth development ages. So it's a really nice paper that pulls together some of the more social interactions with what you develop and where you develop it for them, or where they choose to do it themselves, and then the types of activities that they get involved in and how they play a role in developing those 4 C's, which ultimately lead to those 3 P's. A really important thing. And then finally, as we get to sort of the end of this stretch, there has been research done into the impact of coaching on all of this, specifically coaching. And what we know from some of the research from people like coaching is that if we can comes back to this idea of gaining competence that was spoken about by the Golf Union of Wales chairman, that if we can get people playing and typically that's through coaching, and they're typically likely to have greater enjoyment, be more committed to it, and spend more time playing, which ultimately gives them a more positive experience and an affinity to the game, which is again one of the core reasons why they are retained within the game. However, if we don't do that, they're going to be much less likely to stop playing, and so these are all very high levels of retention that are seen from taking care of people, getting them into not necessarily coaching programs or even into sort of 30-minute golf sessions or 30-minute golf lessons, but just being around them, setting up skills tasks, setting up supervised practice, setting up ways in which you can interact with them, impart a little bit of knowledge, add value to keep them playing to the best of their ability. We'll take a